The dust in the small clapboard church smelled of old pine and nervous sweat. Della stood beside Leland Fuller. Her hands clenched so tightly around a single wilting prairie rose that her knuckles were white stones. This was her wedding day. It felt more like a sentencing. The preacher's words were a low drone, like flies buzzing over something left too long in the sun. She was supposed to be looking at Leland, at the man who would be her husband in moments, but her eyes kept sliding away, catching on the worn floorboards, the way the light fell in a perfect, damning square through the single window. Leland was a man made of smooth surfaces. His suit was dark and well-pressed, a rarity in the town of Redemption. His words were smooth, his promises smoother. He had promised to care for her, to help her manage the Creek Bend ranch her father had carved out of the wilderness with his own two hands. He had promised her security in a world that offered none to a woman alone. Della had clung to that promise, like a drowning woman to a splinter of wood. Her grief over her father's passing 6 months prior was still a raw, open wound, and Leland's attention had been a balm, or so she had told herself. Now, standing beside him, the balm felt like a layer of grease. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed over the preacher's shoulder, out the window, toward the low hills that marked the edge of her property. Her property. The thought landed with the cold weight of a stone in her gut. He loved her land, with its year-round creek that was the envy of every rancher in the territory. Whether he loved her was a question she had been too afraid to ask. And now it was too late. The preacher asked for the rings. Leland produced a thin gold band, his movements efficient and proprietary. As he reached for her left hand, her fingers, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled the prairie rose. It fell to the floorboards with a soft, pathetic sigh of petals. Before she could bend to retrieve it, a dusty boot stepped forward from the first pew. A hand, calloused and sun-darkened, picked up the flower. She looked up into the quietest gray eyes she had ever seen. They belonged to Asa, a man who worked a small spread that bordered her own. They had never spoken more than a handful of words in all the years she'd lived here. He was a man of fences and horses, not words. He saw solitude given form. He held the crushed rose out to her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of something she could not name. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to recognition. He saw her not as a bride, but as a woman standing on a precipice. "Mrs. Fuller," Leland said, his voice tight with annoyance at the interruption. He took her hand, his grip too firm, and slid the ring onto her finger. It felt cold and heavy. Asa's gaze did not waver from hers. He saw the slight tremble in her hand as Leland held it. He saw the way Leland's eyes were fixed on the land deed that the preacher had insisted be present as a formality of the union, a document that bound her future to his. Asa's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had seen that look on a man's face before, the look of a claim jumper, not a husband. He gave Della a slow, deliberate nod, then stepped back into the shadows of the pew, the broken flower still in his hand. The ceremony concluded. The few townspeople in attendance offered polite, thin smiles. Mrs. Weatherly, the town's foremost gossip, patted Della's arm. "Such a sensible match, dear. A woman can't manage a ranch alone." The words were meant to be a comfort, but they sounded like a cage door swinging shut. Leland guided her out of the church, his hand on the small of her back. It was not a gesture of affection, it was a brand. Outside, the sun was a hammer blow. He led her not to a buggy decorated for a wedding, but to his plain work wagon. Her small trunk of belongings was already tied down in the back. "We'll head straight out to the ranch," he said, not looking at her. "There's work to be done. Can't afford a day of sentiment." Della nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She felt a gaze on her and turned. Asa was standing by the church door, leaning against the frame, his arms crossed. He watched the wagon, his face a mask of stone. He was the only one not smiling. He was the only one who seemed to see the day for what it was, a transaction. As their wagon pulled away, kicking up a cloud of ochre dust, he remained there, a silent witness to her surrender. The memory of his gray eyes, steady and knowing, was the only thing she took with her from her wedding day that felt real. The first week of her marriage was a study in quiet disillusionment. The Creek Bend Ranch, once her sanctuary, now felt like a foreign country. Leland moved through the small, familiar rooms of her father's house with an air of ownership that set her teeth on edge. He changed things. He moved her father's worn armchair from its place by the fire, declaring it old and shabby. He took down the string of dried herbs she kept by the kitchen window, complaining of the clutter. Each change was a small erasure of her past. Of her father's memory, of her, he spoke of the land constantly. "We'll run more head of cattle," he'd say, staring out at the pastures her father had so carefully maintained. "And that creek, we can dam it here, control the flow, charge the neighbors for water access in the dry season." "My father never charged anyone for water," Della said softly one evening, her voice barely a whisper. "He said water was life, not profit." Leland turned from the window, and for the first time she saw the smooth mask slip. His smile was gone, replaced by a flat, cold impatience. "Your father was a sentimental old man who died with nothing but this patch of dirt to his name. I intend to be more successful." He said it with a finality that forbade argument. The conversation was over. Her father's philosophy, his legacy of kindness, was dismissed as a failure. Her hidden strength, the thing Leland could not see or value, was her intimate knowledge of the land itself. She knew its rhythms like her own heartbeat. She knew the low spot in the west pasture that flooded in a hard rain. She knew the patch of locoweed hidden in the northern rocks that could poison cattle. She knew the precise way the wind shifted just before a norther blew in. This knowledge was her inheritance, more valuable than the deed itself. One afternoon she saw Leland and their lone, grizzled ranch hand, a man named Silas, driving a small herd of cattle toward the upper meadow, directly toward the creek's headwaters. "What are you doing?" she called, running from the porch. "Watering the stock," Leland called back, waving a dismissive hand. "The lower trough is nearly dry." "You can't let them water there," she insisted, her breath coming in short pants. "That's the spring that feeds the house well. If they foul that water, we'll have nothing clean to drink." Her father had built a complex system of stone-lined channels to divert water for the livestock, keeping the source pure. It was his proudest achievement. Lee leaned in his horse, looking down at her with open contempt. "Woman, are you telling me how to run my own ranch?" Before she could answer, Silas, who had worked for her father for 20 years, spoke up, his voice a low rumble. "She's right, Mr. Fuller. Her pa was mighty particular about that spring. Said a man's foolish to poison his own well." Leland's face darkened with fury. To be contradicted by his wife was one thing. To be questioned by a hired hand in front of her was another. He glared from Silas to Della, his jaw working. For a moment, Della thought he would strike her. The air grew thick and heavy with unspoken violence. But then he seemed to think better of it. A public display would not serve him. "Fine," he spat. "Have it your way. But this ranch needs a firmer hand, a man's hand." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his anger a storm cloud trailing behind him. Della stood, trembling slightly, as Silas quietly turned the cattle away from the spring and toward the proper channel. He didn't look at her, but as he passed, he tipped his hat almost imperceptibly. "Your pa taught you well, missus," he mumbled, and it was the first kind word she had heard in a week. From a ridge on the neighboring property, Asa watched the scene through his field glass. He had seen Leland drive the cattle toward the spring and had felt a knot of anger tighten in his stomach. It was a fool's move, something no real cattleman would do. He watched as Della ran out, her slight frame braced against her husband's ignorance. He saw Leland's rage, saw the way his hand twitched toward his belt, and he saw Della stand her ground. When Silas sided with her, Asa lowered the glasses a slow, grudging respect dawning on his face. She was not as fragile as she looked. She had a spine made of fence wire and rock. The knowledge settled in him, not as a comfort, but as a deeper worry. A woman like that would not bend, and a man like Leland would not stop until he broke her. The days bled into one another, each marked by a growing chill that had nothing to do with the coming autumn. Leland's charm had evaporated entirely. replaced by a constant simmering resentment. He treated Della like a servant in her own home, his words sharp, his silences sharper. She learned the geography of his moods, the subtle shift in his posture that signaled a coming storm, the cold flatness in his eyes that meant she should make herself small and quiet. The slow burn of her isolation was agonizing. The few neighbors who might have visited were kept at bay by Leland's cool dismissiveness. He wanted no witnesses to his quiet campaign of cruelty. Her only human contact, besides her husband's cold commands, was the occasional gruff nod from Silas, the ranch hand, and then there was Asa. She would see him sometimes from her kitchen window, a distant figure on horseback, checking his own fence lines that ran parallel to hers. He never waved, never called out. He was just a presence, a steady, quiet man on a steady, quiet horse. But his presence was a strange comfort. It was a reminder that another world existed just beyond the borders of her gilded cage. One morning, she went out to the chicken coop to find the gate hanging open, the latch broken. A fox had gotten in during the night. The scattered feathers were a testament to the slaughter. Tears of frustration and grief stung her eyes. These were her hens, her small piece of the ranch that still felt like hers. Leland would blame her, would use this as more proof of her incompetence. She was struggling to fix the broken latch, her hands clumsy and cold, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Asa standing there, a coil of wire in one hand and a pair of pliers in the other. He had come across the property line, saw the gate from the ridge, he said, his voice low and even. It was the first time he had spoken to her since the wedding. "Fox?" She could only nod. Wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, she felt a flush of shame. To be seen like this so helpless. He didn't offer condolences or platitudes. He simply took the gate from her hands. "Hinge is rusted through, needs to be replaced. This wire will hold it for now." He worked in silence, his movements economical and sure. His hands, though calloused, were surprisingly deft. He looped the wire, twisted it tight, and tested the gate. It swung shut with a satisfying thud. "Thank you," she said, her voice small. He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the yard. Lingering for a moment on the house. "A good latch keeps more than foxes out," he said. It was not a question but a statement. His gray eyes met hers, and in them she saw that same knowing look from the church. He saw. He knew. He didn't ask for details, didn't pry. He simply acknowledged the truth of her situation with 4 simple words. He turned to leave, then paused. "Your father was a good man, knew his land." He tipped his hat and walked back toward his own property, leaving Della standing by the newly secured gate, the echo of his words a small, warm coal in the cold landscape of her life. He hadn't just fixed gate. He had offered her a sliver of solidarity. He had told her, without saying it, that she was not imagining things, that she was not alone. The slow burn of their connection was built on these silent, stolen moments across the fence line. A few weeks later, she was trying to bring in a newborn calf, whose mother had rejected it. The tiny creature was weak, refusing to stand. Leland had seen it that morning and scoffed. "Leave it for the coyotes. It's a waste of time." Della refused. She had spent hours with the calf, trying to coax it to take milk from a rag soaked in a bucket. It was failing. She sat in the dust of the corral, her dress stained, her heart aching with the tiny, hopeless life in her lap. Just as she was about to give up, Asa appeared at the fence. He didn't dismount. He just sat on his horse watching. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying easily on the still air. "They need the salt." She looked up, confused. "Salt? Put some on your fingers. Let it lick them. The taste can trigger the instinct." He paused. "Your pa used to do it." It was a long shot, but she was desperate. She dipped her fingers in the small salt lick by the trough and offered them to the calf. Its little pink tongue flickered out once, twice. It tasted the salt. A moment later, its mouth began working, searching. She quickly soaked the rag in milk and offered it again. This time the calf latched on, suckling weakly at first, then with more strength. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her washed over Della. She looked up at Asa, her face alight with a gratitude so pure it was painful to see. "It's working," she breathed. He just nodded, his expression unreadable. But the corner of his mouth ticked up, just for a second. He had not just given her advice, he had given her a piece of her father back. He remembered her father's ways, he valued them. In Leland's world, her father was a failure. In Ace's quiet acknowledgement, he was a wise man whose legacy lived on. The contrast was a chasm. Asa watched her for a long moment, his gaze soft. Then he turned his horse and rode away, the silence he left behind filled with a new and dangerous warmth. The weather turned, a sudden autumn storm blowing in from the north. The sky turned the color of a bruise, and a cold, driving rain began to fall. Della rushed to secure what she could, her thoughts on those livestock in the lower pasture near the creek. The rain was coming down in sheets, and she knew how quickly that creek could rise. Leland was gone, having ridden into town for supplies, leaving her and Silas to manage. She found Silas by the barn, struggling with a large section of fence that had been knocked down by a falling cottonwood branch. "We have to move the yearlings," she shouted over the wind. "The creek will flood the bottom land." "Can't, missus," Silas yelled back, his old face grim. "This fence is down. They'll scatter all the way to the territory line if we move 'em now." They needed to lift the heavy section of fence back into place, at least temporarily, to create a holding pen. But it was too heavy for the two of them. As they struggled, the wood slick with rain, another figure appeared through the downpour. It was Asa. His slicker dark with rain, his hat pulled low. He didn't waste time with greetings. He saw the problem and moved to solve it. "On three," he grunted, taking a position between Della and Silas. "1, 2, 3. With his added strength, the section of fence lifted. Della strained, her muscles screaming, her boots sliding in the slick mud. For a moment, her grip slipped. The full weight of the post shifted, and she stumbled back. Asa's arm shot out, his hand clamping around her waist to steady her. His grip was like iron, solid and sure. Through her soaked dress, she could feel the warmth of his hand, a startling point of heat in the cold chaos of the storm. They stood there for a heartbeat, locked together. The wind howled, whipping a strand of her wet hair across her face. He was so close she could smell the rain on his coat, the scent of wet leather and clean earth. His gray eyes were dark with concern. He looked at her, then at the fence, then back at her. In that moment, the world narrowed to the two of them, to the simple, profound fact of his hand holding her steady. It was the first time a man had touched her with simple, uncomplicated support since her father died. It was more intimate than any touch Leland had ever given her. The moment broke. They got the fence propped into place, a crude but effective barrier. Together, the three of them managed to drive the frightened yearlings to higher ground just as the creek began to spill its banks, churning brown water swallowing the pasture. Soaked and shivering, they took shelter in the barn. Silas went to check on the horses, leaving Della and Asa alone in the dusty dimness. The only sound was the drumming of rain on the roof. "You'll catch your death," he said, his voice rough. He shrugged off his heavy wool-lined slicker and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and warm and smelled of him. "I'm fine." She lied, pulling the coat tighter around her. "Thank you, Asa, for everything. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said, her voice firm. "They wouldn't have." She looked up at him, and the pretense fell away. Saw the exhaustion in her face, the fear she lived with every day. And he saw something else, too, a flicker of a bruise high on her cheekbone, near her temple, that she had tried to hide with her hair. He hadn't noticed it in the rain. His whole body went still, his gaze fixed on the mark, and a look of such cold, quiet fury entered his eyes that it made her breath catch. He didn't ask how it got there. He didn't need to. He just looked at the bruise. And then he looked at her, and the space between them vibrated with a terrible, unspoken understanding. His hand lifted, as if to touch her face, but he stopped himself, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. The restraint cost him something. She could see it in the tightening of his jaw. "He'll be back from town soon," she whispered, a warning and a dismissal. Asa held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent promise passing between them. Then he nodded once, turned and walked out into the storm, leaving her wrapped in the warmth of his coat. the weight of his anger a strange and terrifying comfort. He was a good man, a decent man, and that made him the most dangerous man she knew. Because he made her want something she could never have: to be saved. Leland's frustration grew with each passing day. Della was not the pliant, easily molded wife he had expected. Her quiet resilience was a constant irritant. She would not break. So he decided he would have to find another way to take what he wanted. His impatience was making him sloppy. The pretense of a partnership, however thin, was gone. Now there were only demands. He came into the kitchen one evening while she was washing the supper dishes. He didn't speak, just dropped a sheaf of papers on the table beside her. The sound is her jump. "What is this?" she asked, drying her hands on her apron. "Legal papers," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes were sharp, watchful. "Just a formality. It gives me power of attorney to manage the ranch's affairs. It'll be easier to secure loans, buy more stock, make deals in town without needing your signature on every little thing." Della picked up the papers. Though her formal schooling was limited, her father had insisted she learn to read, write, and do sums. "A man who can't read his own contracts is a fool," he used to say. "A woman who can't is a victim." She scanned the dense legal script. The words were convoluted, but the meaning was clear. This was no power of attorney. This was a bill of sale. He was trying to trick her into signing over the deed to the Creek Bend Ranch, to him, for the sum of $1. A cold dread, sharp and metallic, filled her mouth. It was so blatant, so contemptuous of her intelligence. He truly saw her as nothing more than an obstacle, a signature to be obtained. "I won't sign this," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She placed the papers back on the table. Leland's facade of civility shattered. He lunged across the small space, grabbing her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "You will sign it," he hissed, his face inches from hers. His breath was sour with whiskey. "This ranch is mine. It was the moment you said I do. This just makes it official." "No," she said, her fear giving way to a cold, hard knot of defiance. "The deed is in my name. My father left it to me. It is not yours." His eyes were wild with rage. He shoved her backward, and she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the dry sink. "You stupid, stubborn woman. Do you think you have a choice?" He raised his hand, and she flinched, bracing for the blow. But it didn't come. He stopped himself, his hand trembling in the air. He was breathing hard, a vein pulsing in his temple. He was smart enough to know that a badly beaten wife might draw the wrong kind of attention. He needed to maintain the illusion of a respectable marriage, at least for now. He lowered his hand, his lip curling in a sneer. "Fine. We'll do this the hard way." He stalked out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. A moment later, she heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. He had locked her in. She ran to the door, rattling the knob. It was solid. She was a prisoner in her own house. The next morning, Leland did not unlock the door. He left a plate of cold biscuits and a cup of water on the porch, accessible only through the small pass-through window her father had built for firewood. He was treating her like an animal. He rode into town. Della watched him go from the kitchen window, a knot of pure terror tightening in her stomach. Later that day, she saw Mrs. Weatherly's buggy pull up. The woman approached the house, calling Della's name. Leland met her on the porch. Della pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear. "I'm so sorry, Martha," Leland said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Della isn't well, the strain. Her father's passing. It's been too much for her delicate constitution. The doctor said she needs absolute quiet, no visitors." "Oh, the poor dear," Mrs. Weatherly cooed, her voice full of sympathy. "So tragic." "You're a good man, Leland, to care for her so." He was painting her as hysterical, as mentally unwell. He was isolating her, discrediting her in the eyes of the town. If she tried to speak out against him, who would believe her? The mad woman locked away by her long-suffering husband? It was a cunning, cruel trap. The day bled into a night of terrifying silence. The house, once a comfort, was now a tomb. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, sounded like a threat. She was utterly alone, her last sliver of hope dwindling with the fading light. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark, The fraudulent papers, a ghostly white square in the gloom. This was it, the lowest point. He had taken her home, her freedom, and now he was taking her name. She was trapped, and no one was coming to help. Asa knew something was wrong. It was a feeling in his gut, a prickling on his skin. He hadn't seen Della outside for 2 days, not by the chicken coop, not in her garden, not even a flicker of her silhouette in the window. He saw Leland ride to and from town, his posture arrogant and self-satisfied. He saw the town gossip, Martha Weatherly, turned away from the porch. On the evening of the second day, his unease curdled into certainty. He saddled his horse and rode not to Della's house, but to the small shack where Silas, the old ranch hand, lived. He found the old man sitting outside, sharpening a knife with slow, methodical strokes. Silas, Asa said, keeping his voice low. Have you seen the missus? Silas stopped his work, his eyes troubled. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Ain't seen her since Tuesday. He says she's taken ill. The old man didn't meet Asa's gaze. Says she's not in her right mind. Do you believe him? Asa's question was quiet, but it carried the weight of a thrown stone. Silas looked up then, his gaze direct and weary. I believe her pa raised a smart, tough girl. And I believe that Mr. Fuller is a snake with smooth skin. He ran his thumb along the newly sharpened edge of his knife. But I'm an old man who needs a wage. A wage isn't worth a woman's life, Asa said. He told Silas what he'd seen. The bruise. The fear in Della's eyes. The way Leland looked at the land. The old man listened, his face grim. He locked her in, Silas finally said. His voice barely a whisper. Heard the key turn myself. Told me to leave a plate on the porch for her. The shame in his voice was thick. That was all Asa needed to hear. The cold rage he'd felt in the barn during the storm returned, but this time it was honed to a fine point. He didn't ride for the sheriff. Redemption's lawman's was a man who valued a bottle and an easy life above all else. This was not a matter for a badge. This was a matter for neighbors. He left Silas and rode to 2 other ranches, to the homes of men who had known and respected Della's father, men who understood the sacred trust of a property line and the character of the people who lived within it. Inside the house, Della had reached her breaking point. The despair of the night had given way to a desperate, clawing need for freedom. She would not let him win. She would not let him erase her. Her father had not raised a victim. He had raised a survivor. Her mind raced, cataloging every inch of the house she knew so well. The cellar. There was a small root cellar accessible through a trapdoor in the pantry, with a small ground-level door on the outside for loading supplies. It was always barred from the outside, but the bar was old. The wood around it soft with rot. It was a chance. Using the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, she pried open the trapdoor. The cellar was damp and smelled of earth and old potatoes. She scrambled down the ladder, her heart pounding. She found the small exterior door. Pushing against it, she could feel the heavy bar on the other side. She took a deep breath and began to kick. Aiming for the spot where the bar was mounted, she kicked again and again, the sound echoing in the small space. Wood splintered. The bar groaned. On the 5th kick, with a crack of protesting timber, the bar gave way and the door swung open into the pre-dawn darkness. She was free. But she didn't just run. A burning fury propelled her back into the house. She scrambled up the ladder and went straight to the kitchen table. She grabbed the fraudulent papers Leland had tried to force her to sign. Then she went to her father's old writing desk and took out the original. True deed to the Creek Bend Ranch, the one written in his own hand and filed properly with the Territorial Land Office. With both sets of papers clutched in her hand, she fled the house, a ghost slipping into the gray light of dawn. She didn't get far. As she reached the edge of the yard, a figure on horseback appeared on the road, returning from town. It was Leland. He saw her, his face, for a moment registered shock, then twisted into a mask of pure rage. Going where? He snarled, dismounting and striding toward her. He grabbed her, his fingers biting into her arm, and snatched the papers from her hand. You think you can run from me? This is my land, my home. She cried, struggling against his grip. You will not have it. It is already mine, he shouted, shaking her. And so are you. I'd say that's a matter for discussion. The voice was calm, cold, and deadly serious. It came from behind them. Leland whirled around. Asa was sitting on his horse, not 20 feet away. He was not alone. Silas was with him, holding a shotgun loosely in the crook of his arm. And behind them were the two other ranchers Asa had roused, their faces hard and unyielding in the morning light. They were not a posse. They were a jury. "This is a private matter between me and my wife," Leland blustered, trying to regain control. He pushed Della behind him. "A shield and a possession. My wife is unwell. She looks to me like a woman who just kicked her way out of a cellar," Asa said, his eyes never leaving Leland's. "Let her go." "I will not. The deed she's holding," Asa continued, his voice dangerously soft. "The one her father wrote. Is that the same as the paper you're holding, Fuller? The one that sells this whole place for $1? Leland's face went pale. He had been exposed. The ranchers behind Asa murmured, their expressions hardening from suspicion to certainty. They were men of the land. They understood the sacredness of a deed and the evil of a swindle. In that moment, Leland's composure broke. He lunged for Della, trying to drag her back toward the house. But Della was ready. She stomped down hard on his instep with the heel of her boot. He yelped in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She wrenched free, stumbling away from him and toward the silent men on horseback. She did not run behind Asa for protection. She ran to stand beside his horse, her head held high, the true deed clutched in her hand like a shield. She had saved herself. He was there to make sure she stayed saved. Asa dismounted, moving to stand between her and Leland. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. He was a quiet, solid wall of integrity. He had made his choice, publicly, irreversibly. He stood with her against the man who was her husband, against the whispers of the town. He was choosing her over safety, over peace, over minding his own business. Leland looked at the four grim-faced men, at the defiant woman he could not break, and at the quiet cowboy who stood ready to die for her. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. His scheme had crumbled to dust. With a final venomous glare at Della, he scrambled onto his horse and galloped away, not looking back. He left the fraudulent papers scattered in the dirt where he had dropped them. The sun was just beginning to crest the hills, bathing the yard in a clean golden light. Della stood, breathing in the free air. The deed held tight against her chest. Asa turned to her, his gray eyes soft. He reached out not to touch her, but to gently pick a piece of cellar dust from her hair. It was a gesture of infinite tenderness. The rescue was over. The rest of their lives was just beginning. The months that followed were a quiet healing. The story of Leland Fuller's deceit and Della's imprisonment spread through redemption like a prairie fire, carried by Silas and the other ranchers. Public opinion, once so easily swayed by Leland's smooth lies, turned sharply in Della's favor. Mrs. Weatherly even brought over a freshly baked apple pie as a peace offering, her apology as sincere as her gossip had once been malicious. The marriage was swiftly annulled by a traveling judge, the fraudulent document serving as undeniable proof of Leland's character. He was never seen in the territory again. Della, now truly Mrs. Creek Bend, as some of the kinderfolk began to call her, threw herself into the work of her ranch. With Silas as her loyal foreman, she thrived. The land responded to her knowing touch. The cattle grew fat, the fences stood strong, and the creek ran clear. She was no longer just surviving. She was building, creating a future on the foundation her father had left her. The house, once a prison, became her sanctuary again. She moved her father's armchair back to its rightful place by the fire. Asa was a constant, quiet presence. He never presumed, never pushed. He was simply there. He helped her rehang a barn door, his strength a comfortable complement to her own. She brought him a jar of her spiced peach preserves, a silent thank you that spoke volumes. They would often find themselves working along their shared fence line, falling into an easy rhythm of shared labor and comfortable silence. One evening, as sun slid orange and purple across the horizon, Asaf rode over. He wasn't passing by, he had come for a reason. In his hands, he held a length of fresh-cut pine. "The railing on your porch is loose," he said by way of greeting. "Figured I'd fix it before someone takes a fall." She watched as he worked, the scent of sawdust mingling with the cool evening air. He moved with a craftsman's care, his hands sure and steady. He was not making a grand gesture. He was building something small and sturdy. He was fixing what was broken. It was the way of him. He was not a man of flowery speeches or bold declarations. His love was in his actions, a mended gate, a piece of quiet advice, a fence post set firm against the storm. He was building her a shelf for her herb jars without being asked. When he was finished, he tested the new railing. It was solid as rock. He turned to her, his face lit by the last rays of the setting sun. "There," he said. "That should hold." Della stepped onto the porch and stood beside him, her hand resting on the smooth new wood. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the first stars appear in the deep velvet of the sky. The frontier was still wild, the night still long and dark, but she was not afraid. She was not alone. "My father would have liked you," she said softly. "I think he'd be proud of you," Asa replied, his voice a low rumble. He turned to her and his calloused hand found hers, his fingers lacing through her own. It was a simple touch, but it held the weight of everything they had been through, everything they had become. It was a promise of shared sunrises, of fences mended together, of a future built on the solid ground of respect and quiet, unshakable love. The world that had discarded her, that had tried to break her, had been proven wrong. She was home. The cowboy who had seen the truth in her eyes on her darkest day had not just rescued her, he had helped her rescue herself, and in doing so, he had found his own way out of the lonely wilderness of his past. The porch was steady, the night was calm, and their hands, held together, were a testament that, even in the dust and hardship of the West, the most beautiful things were those that were built to last.